The Orwell is the last of the 3 estuaries that joins the North Sea near Harwich. It's not that long, but it packs a lot in within its few miles. It's a bold waterway with an excellent channel, deep and wide enough to accommodate the ocean-going cargo vessels that still use the docks at Ipswich at the top of the navigation. The banks offer views of some classically beautiful Suffolk countryside. And there's enough mud and saltings to attract the seabirds 15 miles inland. The Orwell, though, has now eclipsed the River Crouch and is, I'm afraid, the Hamble of East Anglia. A doubtful accolade for any river. Too many moorings now line the channel, and there are marinas at Leamington, Woolverstone and Ipswich. Too many boats, too many sailors. The upside is that there's plenty of floating real estate to enjoy. From French lozenges to the training schools that pepper the length of the river. It was here that I really learned to sail, team racing in enterprises. There are Thames barges and a few other British classics.
We used to team race on this river, and you can imagine other teams who came here who weren't used to sailing close to big ships found them very, very frightening. But if you nip in front of them, the other guys always chicken out, provided you've got the guts to do it. But when we sailed here, so many people in dinghies got hit by these things. That bow wave just pushes you off. All it does is ding the dinghy. You don't actually die. Brilliant. Of course, the captains used to get really angry with us.
And the commercial traffic, which I always enjoy, makes the river feel like a real working entity. It's a proper link with the past because the Orwell has been a working estuary as long as men have been sailing boats. The Orwell's guaranteed deep water attracts a few Dutch classics. Like me, they were sheltering from the short period of tough weather predicted for the next morning. Seeing them makes me think about taking the slug to Holland. Maybe in a few years' time, though. But there are also a few areas of the Orwell where you can get a feel for the way the river used to be, a place to enjoy the peace and quiet, where the perfectly bucolic landscapes of Suffolk come right down to the water's edge. East Anglian scenes that haven't changed for hundreds of years, and they fueled the creative juices of Suffolk's favourite landscape artist, John Constable. The aesthetic highlight of the river is undoubtedly Pin Mill, a single road coming down to a massive East Anglian hard where Thames barges were built, repaired and restored, where they could be brought up onto the hard standing to wait for the tide to retreat, so that carts could be brought right up alongside. And it's still home to a good fleet of the barges. During the World Wars, it was a sizable and rather hush-hush naval facility. In World War I, it played an important role in the first few rounds of the submarine warfare. The Germans had developed a system for detecting the magnetic fields of ships. So the Brits developed degaussing technology, cables running right around the hulls of naval vessels. The idea was to align their own magnetic fields with that of the Earth, therefore making them invisible to German submarines. High-tech stuff at a time when domestic electric lights were still a novelty in most British homes, and electronics was valves and rheostats. A storm was predicted for the next day, hence the Dutchman. I picked up an empty buoy and spent a quiet night watching the big ships picking their way through the moorings that crowd close to the channel. By first light, the northwesterly had settled in, and I just read and ate and watched the life of the river.
It's pretty windy today. Just going to sit here for a while and wait for it to blow through. However long that's going to take.
Squall after squall came tearing in through the moorings. Bleakly sunny one moment, dark and foreboding the next. In daylight and in this strong crosswind, the pilot's skill becomes even more miraculous. One slip and a few millions worth of private yachts would be soggy toast. Then I watched a Dutch training yacht. They spent ages practicing picking up a mooring. Again and again they picked it up, and then they let it drop again. Why they have to practice between two expensive boats, I've no idea. If I owned one of the neighbouring yachts, I would be pretty well pished at the way they were risking my pride and joy for their training exercise. As the day wore on, the weather started to improve. Yachts started moving. A few hardier souls risked the weather for a bracing belt down the estuary. Then the owners of the Dutch classics decided to raise sail and carry on with their journey. So I dropped the buoy and sailed around them, watching their preparations. They eventually set off down the river, but I headed up it. The weatherman was predicting a spectacular afternoon and evening. You know, there are times when just hanging around and watching can sometimes be almost as good as sailing.
Now the sky is shining like a halo. Strange place.
The Orwell has some really impressive buildings along its length. Most of them belong to rich East Coast merchants. They could watch their money passing up and down the river. One of the most impressive buildings, though, is Woolverstone Hall, built by William Berners. Not personally, you understand. He had it built. Not short of a bob or two was our bill. And I lived there for 7 years. Not a bad gaff, is it? At the time, though, it was a boys' boarding school, run by the Inner London Education Authority. That's right, it was a state-run boarding school. A sort of socialist experiment to see what would happen if you gave ordinary inner London boys from council estates a proper English upper-class boarding school education. And I'm the result. By the time I got there, about a third of the boys were from services families, mostly Army and RAF. The rest of us were Londoners, some from what they used to call broken homes. Now they're called single-parent families, but I reckon in most cases the meaning hasn't actually changed much. My mum and dad were still around, but the reason we went was that there were 6 of us living in a 2-bedroom, 5th-floor flat in Holloway. And for good reason. Woolverstone was sometimes called the poor man's Eton. The school took rugby very seriously. This was our rugby pitch. Not bad, eh? They also took God pretty seriously too. This is the church where we boys were confirmed. But I personally don't think God cared or cares a hoot about Woolverstone, or me, or the slug, so that was one part of the experiment that didn't work. This is the pond in the valley, where we used to build camps and set light to airfix models.
This is the building where I built my first boat. It was the school woodwork shop at the time. Wow, I'd love to have a look through those windows. And this is the little compound where we used to keep our boats. We had a tiny hut here, which sailing parents bought for the sailing master. Which was rather nice. It was about that size. That was the hut that we had. Now it's still being used to teach people to sail, which is a good thing.
And it was on the Orwell that I learned to team race dinghies, which I reckon is the highest form of racing yet invented by man. We raced against real public schoolboys. We were regarded as kind of ersatz versions. But we were good, aggressive sailors and won almost every match. The school is now the private educational establishment it was never meant to be. It's called Felixstowe High, and it's for the daughters of the incredibly rich. Progress? Not in my book, it's not. All I know is that if the state hadn't invested as much as it did in my education, then I would have stayed in the council flat in London and would have not learned that sailing is a wonderful thing, and I wouldn't be making this journey or this film, and you wouldn't be watching it. When I sailed here as a kid, I used to watch the yachts coming and going. The Harwich to Hook of Holland race was always a highlight for us, and I knew that one day I'd sail my own yacht up this river. In my mind's eye, it would look like those classic offshore yachts of the 60s and 70s. It would be a much bigger and more impressive vessel than the Slug turned out to be. But a yacht is a yacht, and the one you can afford to sail now is so much better than the one you're still saving up for. This river's going to get pretty crowded today. During this trip I came up the Orwell twice, once accompanied by my laser sailing son, and the second by my wife of 3 decades. And to my way of thinking, those facts make up for any deficiencies in the size of boat department. We spent a night on the pontoons at the Royal Harwich Yacht Club. Excellent showers, lovely people.
The sailing club has its own cannons. Presented to the Royal Harwich Yacht Club by Colonel R.P. Davies, 1896. Number 1. Number 2.
I owe the RHYC a massive debt of gratitude. At school we sailed on Wednesdays and Saturdays, but the RHYC let us sail in their Sunday series and their summer evening races. That got me on the water 4 days a week. Thanks RHYC, may you last another 100 years. The other thing worth looking at near the water is the cat house. At one time it was a chandlery. Now it's a private house, and very nice it is too. But in the days of smuggling contraband, when the shore was clear of excise men, they used to put a cardboard cat in the window and put a light behind it. Or maybe the cat was there when the coast wasn't clear. One or the other. Man, I would have been a lousy smuggler. One evening I spotted this weird-looking day boat, an Orwell Corinthian. At one time there was a fleet here. All but gone, but attempts are being made to resurrect the class. Here's the thing. George Orwell, the man who wrote 1984 and The Road to Wigan Pier, whose real name was Blair, and like me, was also a one-time BBC hack, nicked the name of the Orwell for his nom de plume. He used a different name for his novels because he knew that the BBC wouldn't appreciate the powerful political line he was taking in them. Which is why these films are made completely free of any political bias whatsoever. And, confession time here, my real name is not Dylan Winter. It's Satan The top of the navigation is Ipswich. It's here that the Orwell changes name and becomes the Gipping or Jipping. At school, Ipswich was always known as Potown, or occasionally Jippo. Now I know why. The Ipswich docks aren't in the best of health. Too small to accommodate the monsters that use the container port down at Felixstowe.
Some of the sailors keep up the tradition of writing their names along the quayside. I mean, it's hard to resist. They're sent down the side of the boat with a pot of paint and a brush. And room for the discontented to leave their messages too, warning to other sailors not to work for certain lines. Leaving the UK there.
But when they built the A14 bridge, the docks were still important enough to force the architects to leave air clearance for sea-going ships. The great, elegant, sweeping curve of the bridge will remain as the major legacy of Ipswich docks once they stop being used for commercial shipping and have been subsumed in a tidal wave of marinas and residential riverside developments. Right now they're still a working entity, and this close up the ships look pretty big, but the days of the docks are numbered. I'm pleased I saw them before they died completely. It might take a decade or more, but it's almost inevitable. Next up, the Deben, which, as East Anglian rivers go, is about as posh as they come. But it's a beautiful waterway.
7 foot chicken.